Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1, I call Collette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the Read, Write, Count with the First Minister programme.
Minister Graham Day.
Thank you, President Officer. The Read, Write, Count with the First Minister programme is an important part of the Scottish Government's commitment to raising attainment by building parents' confidence and encouraging families to include reading, writing and counting activities in their everyday lives. The programme provides literacy and numeracy materials to pupils in primaries 2 and 3, and last year 248,000 books were provided to children across Scotland. The Government is currently working with the Scottish Book Trust to finalise arrangements for the provision of materials in 2024.
Collette Stevenson.
I thank the Minister for that response. East Kilbride has more than 20 recognised reading schools, including the Gold accredited St Andrews and St Bride's High. Initiatives like this and Read, Write, Count are helping attainment by building parents' confidence and supplying books and activities for children. However, while the Scottish Government does this good work, Labour-run South Lanarkshire Council are threatening to close Greenhills Library and Community Hall, widely used by reading groups and toddler groups. In my view, this would potentially increase the poverty-related attainment gap. Does the Minister share my concerns and those of the 1,700 locals that have signed a petition against it, that the Labour-run Council's proposals will be bad for the community, and can he reiterate the benefits of the Scottish Government's budget to South Lanarkshire Council?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, I do understand the member's concerns and those of her constituents as she's articulated, because library services are a vital and valued community resource. In relation to the budget question, in 2024-25, South Lanarkshire Council will receive £742.7 million to fund local services, which equates to an extra £45.9 million to support vital day-to-day provision, or an additional 6.6% compared to 23-24. So whilst these are ultimately decisions for the Council to take, this Government is providing a fair funding settlement despite the cuts to our budget.
Question number 2, Rachael Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the potential impact of the £58.7 million reduction to the College Operational Expenditure budget for 2024-25 on the Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire constituency.
Minister Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Budget allocates funding to the college sector as a whole. Indicative funding allocations for colleges are expected to be set out by the SFC in spring 2024, as is normally the case. Once allocations are published, each college will know its position and therefore be able to consider any impact, although I know individual colleges are already working on projections based on a working assumption of flat cash or a slight reduction. The SFC is endeavouring to deliver a core teaching funding allocation that is as close as possible to core teaching funding colleges received in 23-24.
Rachael Hamilton.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Colleges like Borders College in my constituency play a vital role to communities by upskilling future generations. As a direct result of these resource spending cuts, students will now see their learning opportunities diminish. Colleges will have to make tough choices about what subjects they can offer, which staff to keep, and crucially, how many students they can offer places to. The Minister can make all the excuses he wants, but it is clear that the SNP have either forgotten about the importance of colleges or they just don't care about them. Minister, which one is it?
Minister.
Well, the usual crocodile tears for the Tories, because let's not forget where the budget problems are coming from: Westminster. Presiding Officer, we are involved in detailed direct discussions with the colleges about their future budgets and the impacts of those, as are the SFC. And I do say to the member, there is detailed engagement with the colleges about the long-term future through the reform agenda to try and ensure that not only does the future provision meet the needs of employers, the economy and learners at a national level, but also more locally. And that would take account of the fact that delivering in areas such as the borders can come at a greater cost than other parts of the country. So there's a considerable amount of work going on here directly with colleges.
Let's keep our questions and answers concise, please. I call Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite a challenging and difficult financial climate created by irresponsible and reckless Conservative fiscal policy, I welcome that the Scottish Government has increased investment in education and skills budget by £128 million. So in respect of college budgets, can the Minister share how the starting position for 2024 to 25 compares to the end position for 2023-24?
Minister.
Well, as I think I said a moment ago, Presiding Officer, the aim here is that the funds available to colleges at the start of 24-25 financial year will be very similar to the funds that were actually invested in the colleges in the current financial year. And that's despite an incredibly challenging financial set of circumstances. We're doing everything we can to support our colleges and universities, recognising the extraordinary impact they have on our economy and society and the pivotal future roles that we see for them both.
Question number 3, Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to review the operations of the Parole Board for Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance.
Presiding Officer, I recognise the critical role of the Parole Board for Scotland and the role it plays in our justice system. The Scottish Government works with the Independent Parole Board for Scotland in support of its statutory functions. That includes, for example, reviewing and updating the Parole Board rules to ensure that they remain fit for purpose. Those rules were updated in 2021 and 2022. There are no current plans for a further review of the rules at this stage, but I do keep this under close and careful consideration, and as the member will appreciate, decisions by the Parole Board in the exercise of its statutory functions are independent of Scottish ministers.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. This Parliament recently updated the rules for the Parole Board, including giving victims certain rights which dictate what the Parole Board must do. But the Parliament also gave the Board wider powers that they could use. Is the Cabinet Secretary, content that the Board is doing everything that it can possibly do for victims, rather than limiting itself to what it must do?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it is critical that the views of victims are heard at all stages in the justice system, and that includes parole. No part of the justice system is beyond scrutiny or challenge, particularly when it comes to what more we can do to support victims. As highlighted, the Parole Board rules were updated in 2021 and 2022, and this means that victims or family members of victims can apply to the Parole Board of Scotland to observe hearings. This, of course, is a matter for the legal chair, but the legal chair has facilitated this on many occasions. And this also builds on the existing rights of victims to make representations in writing or verbally to members of the Parole Board before decisions are made. And of course there's the valuable work undertaken by the victims team that sits within Parole Scotland, and I'm conscious that I have outstanding correspondence to the member in relation to victims' right vis-à-vis those wider powers that he references.
Question number 4, Stephen Kerr.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of its current relationship with local authorities.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
The Scottish Government recognises the value that local government contributes to delivering vital services across the country. Since the signing of the Verity House Agreement in June last year, good progress has been made, and there are a number of positive examples of collaborative working between central and local government. Through my monthly relationship meetings with the COSLA presidential team, we jointly review the progress on our collaborative working on an ongoing basis. First Minister and Deputy First Minister met with the COSLA presidential team last week to discuss the importance of our relationships, and the DFM and I met with COSLA political leaders just yesterday.
Stephen Kerr.
Well, that was an optimistic response from the Minister, because everybody knows the Verity House Agreement is dead in the water. We've all seen the letter from the Deputy First Minister that was sent sometime yesterday. True to form, it was leaked to the Daily Record. So much then for their full-funded council tax freeze. If he thinks, and if the Deputy First Minister thinks that this shows a functioning, working relationship between the SNP government and local government, she is mistaken. Some councils are setting their budgets today, some set them last week. Does he not agree that by the chaos that his government has created through the Scottish Government budget process, he and the rest of the government have shown their complete disdain for local democracy?
Minister.
No, I don't, and I'm surprised by the member's question around the council tax freeze, because I thought the Conservatives supported the council tax freeze. I certainly know that the people of Scotland support the council tax freeze. The Scottish Government believes that at a time when rising prices are putting significant strain on household finances, and that largely caused by the actions of his UK Government, the freeze will give some certainty to households over the coming years. And I think it's really important to remember that as a proportion of income, council taxpayers on the lowest incomes will benefit the most from the council tax freeze. And when taken alongside our income tax policies, it is independently recognised as being progressive.
Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In an attempt to repair the damaged relationship with local government, it's been reported, as Mr Kerr says, that the Cabinet Secretary has offered to restore the £63 million previously cut from council budgets. Can I ask the Minister if that funding restoration is also dependent on councils agreeing the council tax freeze?
Minister.
The Deputy First Minister previously indicated that, subject to the UK budget next week, there will be £45 million of consequentials coming from the UK Government's decision to give some additional very ring-fenced funding to local government there. And the Deputy First Minister has announced that she wants to increase that to the full nearly £63 million. The big challenge is to make sure that money is real. So I call on colleagues across the chamber to demand that the UK Chancellor make sure that the budget on the 6th of March is a budget that protects services and does not give more tax cuts to the wealthy.
Question number 5, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to ensure that railway infrastructure is safe and fit for the future.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
Safety of the railway is a key priority for Scottish ministers, though it is ultimately a matter reserved to the UK Government. The independent rail regulator, the ORR, is responsible for ensuring Network Rail meets its safety responsibilities and determines the appropriate funding. The Scottish Government has fully funded Network Rail Scotland in line with the ORR's recommendations and is investing record sums in rail, with total funding for the rail sector in Scotland of £1.6 billion in 2024-25. This compares to pre-pandemic levels of some £0.9 billion to £1 billion.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the Minister for that response. Springburn Railway Station does not offer step-free access, making it inaccessible for wheelchair users. The Scottish Government must do all within its gift to ensure equal access to Scotland's railway. So will the Minister make representation to the Department for Transport to press for access for all scheme funding for Control Period 7 so that much-needed improvements can be made at last to Springburn Railway Station?
Cabinet Secretary.
I understand the member has just written to me. I think I've just replied, or it might be a question. As he recognised, this is an accessibility programme and funding that he has alluded to is the responsibility of the UK Government. But I, like him, will make sure my discussions with both Network Rail and the ORR and indeed others to make sure that accessibility is a key priority. Indeed, I'm just leaving this session of Parliament this afternoon to have a meeting with mobility and access groups.
Brief supplementary, Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A train derailment on the Aberdeen to Dundee line at Carmont in 2020 tragically saw 3 lives lost. So can I ask the Minister to outline what work has been done to improve safety and resilience on the Aberdeen to Dundee line?
Cabinet Secretary.
Our thoughts remain first and foremost with all those affected by that tragic accident at Carmont. While rail safety, as I've said, is reserved to the UK Government, the Scottish Ministers are committed to doing everything we can to help prevent accidents and ensure that passengers travel safely on our rail network. Network Rail, which has overall responsibility for the network, is addressing the infrastructure recommendations set out in the Rail Accident Investigation Branch's report, which followed this tragic derailment. For example, there's better management of civil engineering construction activities by Network Rail and its contractors. There's improved operational responses to extreme rainfall events, utilising the full capability of modern technology and based on a detailed understanding of the risk associated with extreme rainfall, as well as other matters. And we are fully funding, as I said, that maintenance and future-proofing as set out in my previous answer.
Liam Kerr.
Very grateful, Presiding Officer. The Class 43 high-speed trains were, in the report into Carmont, partially thought to be responsible for the consequences. Transport Minister, when will the Class 43 be replaced?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the question of infrastructure covers obviously the infrastructure on the network, and then the member is referring to the fleet itself. I would refer the member to the reports into Carmont in relation to the fleet itself. I've had discussions with the unions and indeed with ScotRail in terms of the future provision. As he might be aware, we are looking very carefully at the timing and when, in relation to other matters, that fleet would be replaced.
Question number 6, Ash Regan.
To ask the Scottish Government, as part of its work to further the case for Scottish independence, and in light of the Supreme Court ruling that the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence, the reason for its position that there should not be a referendum at this stage on the powers of the Scottish Parliament.
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
In line with the mandate secured democratically at the 2021 Scottish Parliament election, the Scottish Government wants to hold a referendum on Scottish independence that would lead to Scottish independence rather than a referendum on the powers of the Scottish Parliament short of that. For this reason, at this stage, we do not plan to hold such a referendum. Where any proposal for such emerges, we will give it proper consideration. Through our Building a New Scotland series of prospectus papers, we continue to set out the positive case for independence as an alternative to the broken Brexit Britain now in recession, supported by the Tories, Labour and Liberal Democrats.
Ash Regan.
This will be 10 years since the independence referendum. 10 years of a majority government. With respect, Minister, papers can be produced by anyone. What the independence movement wants at this point is action. Time is of the essence, and the government should embrace the opportunity to give Scots the power to tell the world that they want the Scottish Parliament to negotiate for and legislate for independence. And if they don't, this entire 5-year parliamentary term will have been wasted. Perhaps the Minister can enlighten us. What is the point of a pro-independence majority if it is not used to pursue independence?
Minister.
Well, of course, that's exactly what we're doing. And with respect to Ms Regan, I have literally just said, and we don't even have a draft proposal with the consequential consultation that would come, let alone a final proposal before this Parliament. But I have said, if that emerges, we'll give it full consideration. But of course, the manifesto, which I stood on, which she stood on as well, said that we should have a referendum. We have that mandate. That should be irrespective. It also set out that we take forward the work that we're taking through the Building a New Scotland series of prospectus papers. I brought 4 debates to this chamber on the Banch paper on the written constitution, the 27th of June last year, on migration, the 14th of November last year, on Scotland's place in the EU, 30th of January this year, on social security on the 20th of February this year. I know the member hasn't been able to take part in any of those debates yet, but the good news is she and all members of this place will have the opportunity to do so in the future, because we're going to continue taking forward that work.
Question number 7, Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government, in light of the First Minister's reported comments that it is, quote, has to go further to ensure that plans to radically reform how young people are cared for in Scotland are realised, whether it has identified what steps it will take to achieve this.
Minister Natalie Dawn.
The Scottish Government is clear in our commitment to keep the promise, and we've made really good progress, but of course there's always further that we can go. Action is underway across ministerial portfolios, including progress to stage 3 of the Children's Care and Justice Bill, engagement on our commitment to a £2,000 care leaver payment, and investment in prevention through whole family wellbeing. In the last year, I've seen many great examples of transformational activity across Scotland in education, justice and children's services, and I've been clear that where it is required, I want to see that best practice shared and replicated across Scotland. In terms of moving forward, the Scottish Government will publish a review of our Promise Implementation Plan this spring to update on the actions and commitments underway.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for that response. And last Friday was, of course, Care Day, the biggest celebration of care experienced children around the world. But Who Cares Scotland's recent report highlights at least amber, if not red, with some of the things that we're trying to achieve. An absence rate of 83% among social workers in one local authority, concerns about restraint, concerns about informal school exclusions, concerns about data. So Scotland will keep the promise, but when will Scotland see the illuminated path to actually achieving it in the time that we have promised?
Minister.
Well, I thank the member for that question. And equally, I'm thankful for the Who Cares Scotland report, which highlighted those areas where further work is required. We are absolutely determined to drive forward the transformational change required to keep the promise, and I fully believe that the actions this government has, are and will take will help us to achieve that. As well as the areas I've already mentioned, and specifically in relation to Mr Whitfield's points, we are seeing clear progress across a number of areas, such as the increase in the numbers of virtual head teachers across Scotland, a model that's showing real progress in reducing exclusions. We've had the publication of the Hearings for Children redesign report, and the member, I'm sure, will be aware of the government response to that. And in terms of data, we have seen progress, but I'm willing to discuss any areas of concern with the member. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. Before we move to First Minister's questions, I invite members to join me in welcoming to the gallery Hannah Neighbour, President of the State Parliament of Lower Saxony. The next item of business is First Minister's questions, and at question number 1 I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This morning, Audit Scotland released a damning report on the state of Scotland's NHS. Amongst many shocking figures, people waiting over a year for treatment has jumped from 3,500 to 40,000. That's an 11-fold increase since 2019, despite patient numbers falling. When he was Health Secretary, Humza Yousaf brought in his NHS recovery plan that was supposed to bring waiting times down. So why, First Minister, are things getting worse, not better?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, first and foremost, let me say that we take very seriously the comments in the report by the Auditor General that were published this morning. There's simply no doubt, or indeed attempts by us to downplay the seriousness of the challenges the health service is facing as it recovers from what is undoubtedly the biggest shock of its 75-year existence, the global pandemic. And of course there are challenges for every single health service right across the UK. To answer Douglas Ross's question directly, we are still facing the cumulative impacts of the pandemic. People are still, for example, winter, suffering from COVID. That has an impact not just, of course, on IPC within hospitals, but also, of course, on staff who are able to perform elective care and treatments and surgeries. These are common challenges. I accept, of course, they are my responsibility here in NHS Scotland, as well as the health secretaries. These are common challenges right across the country. In fact, if I look at some of the latest data in September last year, it did show that Scotland, there was 123 patients waiting per 1,000 of the population for the treatment time guarantee and new outpatient appointments. That is fewer than in England, where it's 137 per 1,000 on the referral to treatment waiting list. And in Wales, that figure is 245 per 1,000. So my point in making that is that, of course, there are challenges that Scotland's NHS is facing. Of that, there is no doubt. These are common challenges right across the UK, and what we'll do is make sure we fund the NHS, and that's why I'm pleased that in the budget announced by the Deputy First Minister last year that we invested a record £19.5 billion in our health service.
Douglas Ross.
This is an Audit Scotland report into NHS Scotland. Please, First Minister, focus on our NHS here in Scotland. Because that shocking 11-fold increase in people waiting over a year is, of course, against a target which should be zero. There was a target for March 2023 for people waiting over a year to be eradicated. Instead, it is now over 40,000. And Audit Scotland say that the latest SNP targets to reduce waiting times are unlikely to be met. Those are Humza Yousaf's targets. It was his recovery plan. When he was Health Secretary, he said this plan will drive the recovery of our NHS, not just to pre-pandemic level, but beyond. Yet another example of Humza Yousaf winging it. That arrogant claim now rings hollow, and patients in Scotland are suffering. Humza Yousaf sent waiting times in the wrong direction. Will he now finally admit his plan has failed?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, here is what we have managed to achieve, and I accept, of course, there's still a way to go, and I accept, of course, the recommendations of the Audit Scotland report. But we have seen, because of the investment that we've made in national treatment centres, an additional 20,000 procedures through the investment in our national treatment centres. It's why we've seen also an increase in the last 12 months, an 11% increase in performed operation over the last year. It's why outpatients waiting longer than 2 years has fallen by almost 70%. Inpatient day case patients waiting the longest fallen by over 25%. And that is why we're investing over £19.5 billion, a record amount, in our National Health Service. What makes that recovery, of course, more difficult is a 10% cut to our capital budget, which means we have less to spend on capital health infrastructure. What makes that job more difficult, Presiding Officer, is only being provided £10.8 million of health consequentials in the UK Government's autumn statement, enough for 5 hours of NHS activity. So while the Conservatives rightly will ask questions about what further we can do, let me say that this SNP government will invest in our NHS, unlike Douglas Ross's party, who are cutting the funding to the bone.
Douglas Ross.
It's not just the Conservatives that are asking these questions, it's Audit Scotland, and crucially, it's our constituents who are suffering. But as usual, Humza Yousaf promised the world and delivered very little. Just like the ferries he claimed he would build, just like the Hate Crime Act that he said would be a success, just like the trains that he promised to get to run on time. Audit Scotland say they can't even fully measure how badly his recovery plan has failed because the SNP has not been transparent with the public. This is what they say. Updates against a range of the ambitions are absent. Humza Yousaf is covering up just how bad it's been. But the reason for this failure is clear from the report. Audit Scotland states there is no overall vision for Scotland's NHS. No overall vision. How can Humza Yousaf and this SNP government have no vision for Scotland's NHS?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, again, we will respond to the Audit Scotland report in due course. But let me say to Douglas Ross that when it comes to the SNP stewardship of our NHS, that stewardship, of course, has seen record investment in our NHS of over £19.5 billion. It has seen resource funding more than double, increased by over 100% since we've been in power. It's showing record staffing in our NHS of over 31,300 whole-time equivalents. There's more nurses in Scotland per head than in England. We have the best NHS staff anywhere in the UK. We have the best performing A&E departments, not for 1 year, not for 5 years, but for 8 consecutive years, Presiding Officer. And because we value our NHS staff, we are the only nation in the UK not to have NHS staff go on strike, Presiding Officer. When it comes to the challenges that our NHS is facing, undoubtedly facing, I'm not downplaying them, this government is making sure that we invest in that recovery. But the difference between the Tories and the SNP, Presiding Officer, is that we will invest in our NHS while the Conservatives are cutting it right down to the bone.
Douglas Ross.
There is no vision for Scotland's NHS. Not my words, but the words of the Auditor-General for Scotland. And they make it very clear that the lack of vision has not just happened because of the pandemic and the issues that our NHS faced. There has not been a vision for Scotland's NHS since 2013. They say, and I quote, "There has been no unified vision for the future direction of the entire healthcare system published since 2013. 2013. Hamza Yousaf has no vision for Scotland's NHS. He's been asleep at the wheel like every other SNP First Minister. There's been a lost decade of leadership in Scotland's NHS. 10 years of stalling and delay has had dire consequences for patients. How long are people in Scotland going to have to wait for the SNP to get their act together?
First Minister.
Officer are investing in that recovery now. That's why, for example, those outpatients waiting the longest has reduced by almost 70%. It's why inpatients waiting the longest have reduced by over 25%. It's why operations performed in the last 12 months have increased by 11%. It's why, through our investment, we've created additional capacity for 20,000 procedures. It's why we're investing a record £19.5 billion in our NHS, despite the fact that the UK Government, in their autumn statement, provided less than £11 million for NHS health consequentials. That's enough to fund 5 hours of NHS activity, Presiding Officer. So I will take not a single lecture from Douglas Ross about investing in our NHS when his party is responsible for a 10% capital cut in our budget, which is deeply impacting our health infrastructure. Douglas Ross, Presiding Officer, I'm afraid is presiding over a party that has taken a hatchet to our public services. So while they cut it to the bone, we'll continue to invest in the most precious institution in this country, our National Health Service.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis where too many people are struggling to make ends meet. At the same time, oil and gas giants are making record profits. British Gas, a tenfold increase in profits in 1 year to over £700 million. BP, £11 billion profit. Total, £16 billion profit. Shell, £22 billion profit. Why does the First Minister think that these companies can't afford to pay more tax?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I have to say, a week after the P&J put Anna Sarwar's face on the front page with his Labour colleagues and called him a traitor of the North East, it is incredibly brave of Anna Sarwar to come up here and say that he is standing up for the North East.
Let's hear the First Minister.
I, of course, travelled to the North East this week and heard the palpable anger from oil and gas and renewable energy sectors and industries, who, of course, spoke about Anna Sarwar's plans, the Labour Party's plans, which would, in their words, not my words, in the industry's words, risk up to 100,000 jobs in the North East. How does Anna Sarwar think, in the midst of a cost of living crisis, throwing 100,000 workers in the scrap heap is going to help households up and down the country? So we absolutely believe in a windfall tax on energy companies. What we don't believe in is Anna Sarwar's
let
and
us
Labour's
hear the First Minister.
aggressive plans to raid the North East
so they can build new nuclear power plants in England. So we won't allow it. We won't stand for it. We'll stand up for the North East. Anna Sarwar can't even stand up to Keir Starmer, presiding officer.
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding officer. Presiding officer.
Thank you. Let's hear Mr Sarwar.
Every time Labour's proposed a change to help working people, warnings have been made and they've not come true. In 1997, when Labour proposed a minimum wage and a windfall tax, they were warned it would cost 2 million jobs. It didn't happen. It improved the lives of working people across the country. Now, Hamza Yusuf used to support Labour's windfall tax, but now he's siding with energy giants, making record profits, while today he is putting up tax for working people across this country who are struggling. Maybe
Let's hear Mr
listen.
Sarwar.
While Shell have brought in £22 billion in profit, energy bills have increased by 60% and people are struggling to heat their homes. While BP make £11 billion in profit, food prices are up 25% and people are struggling to put food on the table. While British Gas sees a tenfold increase in profits, mortgages have increased by £2,000 a year and families risk losing their home. Why does the SNP believe that if you earn £28,500, you have the broadest shoulders and should pay more tax, but if you're an energy giant making billions in profit, you should pay less tax?
First Minister.
Presiding officer, imagine taking a lecture about standing up for those in the lowest incomes from the man who's flip-flopped his position and now believes in lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, presiding officer. Oh, wow! Who would have thought? Who would have thought? The party of the few, not the party of the many, presiding officer. And it is astonishing that Anna Sarwar has stood up in this chamber and called the energy industry liars. That is what he has done. Let me just say what Offshore Energy UK have said. They claim that Labour's proposals would lose at least up to 42,000 jobs, and I quote, wipe out North Sea investment. Investment bank Stifel have said that under a worst-case scenario, Labour's proposals would wipe up to 100,000 jobs out. Put them on the scrap heap. So what you get with Labour's energy proposal, presiding officer, is the worst of both worlds. You end up getting all of the investment in oil and gas, which of course has been good for Scotland over the decades. That gets completely wiped out. And then what does Keir Starmer do? He dumps his £28 billion a year Green Prosperity Fund. Scotland's energy should be in Scotland's hands because successive Westminster governments have raided the North East, have raided Aberdeen, have raided our oil and gas revenues, and not a single penny has been invested back into the people of Aberdeen or the North East. And for that, Anna Sarwar should stand up and apologise.
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding officer, I can't wait to present the choice at the next general election between the SNP and the Labour Party.
Let us hear.
I can't wait.
Mr. Sarwar. Sorry. Let's ensure that we can hear one another. Mr. Sarwar.
I was just saying, presiding officer, I can't wait to present the choice to the Scottish people come to the next general election, because firmly the SNP on the side of energy giants making billions and Labour trying to bring down people's bills and on the side of working people. But let's be clear what Labour's windfall tax on record profits of energy giants will be spent on. It will mean more jobs, lower bills, greater energy security and delivering a just transition for Scotland. It will mean investment in GB Energy,
us hear Mr. Sarwar.
A publicly owned energy generation company headquartered here in Scotland. It will mean investment in our ports, in onshore wind, offshore wind, green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and strengthening our supply chains. It will mean creating 50,000 new jobs in Scotland. So isn't it the case that the Scottish people have a choice? The SNP increasing tax on working people while siding with the oil and gas giants, or Labour creating jobs, bringing down bills and firmly on the side of working people?
First Minister.
Presiding officer, first can I can I remind Anna Sarwar, when he talks about people in the midst of a cost of living crisis, he now has flip-flopped his way to being in a position where he believes on retaining the cap on the child benefits, but wants to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses, presiding officer. It is utterly outrageous. And let me say to Anna Sarwar, when I was in Aberdeen earlier this week, I can't wait to go head-to-head with Anna Sarwar in Aberdeen on the general election. And in fact, he can debate the oil and gas industry and renewables with me in Aberdeen any and every single day of the week. And Anna Sarwar claims that the Labour and incoming Labour government will make all sorts of investments.
First Minister, if you just give me a moment.
They don't like it, presiding officer. They don't like it one single bit.
First Minister, just give me a moment. Let's ensure we carry on our proceedings with courtesy and respect. Let's ensure we can hear one another.
And Anna Sarwar claims that there will be a whole range and raft of investment from an incoming Labour government. Of course, what is obvious, presiding officer, is the branch manager didn't get the memo that the £28 billion has been dumped. So not a single penny of that investment is going to be coming to Scotland. So, presiding officer, successive UK governments have taken £400 billion in today's prices in oil and gas revenue, raided the North Sea as a cash cow without investing a fraction of it back in the North East and back in Aberdeen. With Anna Sarwar's plans, you end up with 100,000 workers on the scrap heap and no investment in our net zero ambitions. Isn't it about time that Scotland's energy was in Scotland's hands, presiding officer?
Question number 3, Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, presiding officer. To ask the first...
Sorry. We cannot hear Ms Chapman. Question number 3, Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, presiding officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on whether successive changes to national taxation policy in Scottish budgets will support the redistribution of wealth and help sustain vital public services.
First Minister.
Well, in short, yes, our changes to income tax in Scotland has made it more progressive. This approach means that we have an additional £1.5 billion to invest in 24-25 from income tax compared to if we'd matched UK government policy, something Douglas Ross, of course, advocated at the time. That £1.5 billion being invested in public services to try and offset the huge impact on the availability of public spending by Westminster austerity. With further powers such as those needed to tax wealth effectively, we could do so much more to build on our progressive tax system and, of course, further protect public services here in Scotland.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. We all have too many constituents struggling with grinding poverty for whom public services are a lifeline. I am proud that tax changes, which the Scottish Greens have championed, mean that £1.5 billion more is available for those services. Tax changes which mean the better off pay more and the people on lower incomes pay less. Those promising tax cuts must be honest about what services they would cut. The STUC has argued, and the First Minister has just recognised, that Scotland can and should do more to use tax powers to redistribute wealth and makes the case that taxation is a public good. Can I ask the First Minister how he plans to build that consensus for progressive taxation as a force for good?
First Minister.
Well, government is absolutely committed, as I've said, to progressive taxation. I thank the STUC and others for the contribution that they've made. Of course, and the Deputy First Minister engaged with a number of stakeholders in relation to our progressive taxation plans. And we'll continue to have that engagement with stakeholders. And, of course, that includes the business community and, of course, the people of Scotland around our progressive taxation plans. And poll after poll tells us that the public support public service investment is backed by progressive taxation. So when Douglas Ross stood up in this chamber and urged the Scottish Government to follow the disastrous Liz Truss budget, he needs to have the humility to say how wrong he was. And when Anna Sarwar says that he will cut taxes for the highest earners, he needs to be honest about what public services will he cut. His tax plans in the round, presiding officer, will reduce revenue by £561 million. Will that mean he'll scrap the Scottish child payment? Will it mean he'll scrap free prescriptions? Will it mean he'll scrap free bus travel? Or, as his finance spokesperson hinted just this week, that will they end up scrapping free university education? So, presiding officer, we'll continue our commitment to progressive taxation, our commitment to the social contract in Scotland, which provides tuition fees provides that there is no tuition fees for higher education, provides widespread access to bus services, free prescriptions and a host of other benefits, and of course will seek common cause with others like the STUC who believe in progressive taxation.
Colin Beattie.
The SNP Scottish Government's progressive tax plans help to deliver a strong social contract, ensuring additional targeted funding to protect people and our vital public services. Meanwhile, Scottish Labour's priorities appear to be elsewhere, seeming to indicate last weekend that they now support cutting income tax. Can the First Minister provide any update regarding what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the impact which this could have on Scotland's public finances and the Scottish Government's ability to fund public services?
First Minister.
Well, we know that from the Conservatives, if we'd follow their budget proposals, of course, we'd have £1.5 billion less to spend. We know from Anna Sauer's tax policies in the round that we think there will be about £561 million less to spend and invest in our NHS, in our education, in our justice services, in social security. And of course, Anna Sauer has made the point that those earning, for example, £30,000 pay more here in Scotland. They pay 94 pence a month more, and for that, of course, get free university education, get the most generous childcare offer anywhere in the UK, end up, of course, not paying a single penny for their medicines, ensure that they get free personal and nursing care, and a whole range of other benefits. And that's why poll after poll shows that the public are supportive of progressive taxation if it is used, as we are doing, to invest in our public services. So if Labour want to continue to give people like Anna Sauer a huge tax cut, which will end up, of course, reducing the revenue we have to spend on public services, he has to have the honesty to say what public services he'll be cutting.
Question number 4, Fergus Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister regarding the delivery of the Scottish Government's recently published Depopulation Action Plan, what will be different about this approach, which is described as local by default, national by agreement, particularly towards the approval of new developments supported by local communities?
First Minister.
The Addressing Depopulation Action Plan does set out the Scottish Government's strategic approach aimed at supporting local communities that are facing population decline. And I know it's an issue that the member has a significant interest in. And of course that is set against the very devastating impact that a hard Brexit is having on our rural and island communities. In terms of what the plan will do, it will deliver a whole new programme of work which will support and empower affected areas through funding, new research, enhanced partnership working with those local communities. And we do acknowledge, as Fergus Ewing has said, the importance of local leadership and that communities are best placed to respond to their own challenges.
Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, young people leaving Scotland for other countries forever, for their lifetime, has been Scotland's tragedy and our shame. Therefore, will he, where there is a chronic depopulation problem, now agree that economic developments which would bring major jobs and major community benefits will henceforth be treated as developments of national economic significance?
First Minister. Presiding Officer, I'm more than happy to look at that proposal. Of course, when planning applications are called into the Scottish Government, the whole range of factors are considered. Of course, the natural environmental impact, but also the economic impact is, of course, important. I won't comment on any, of course, specific live application, but Fergus Ewing is absolutely right. If we want to retain our young people, then we have to ensure that we create the economic opportunities. We have to ensure that we invest in the housing, which we're doing, of course, through our affordable housing supply programme in our rural communities, and we have to ensure that we invest in the connectivity, which of course we are also doing as well. But Fergus Ewing makes some very important points, but what is devastating our rural communities undoubtedly is the hard damage that has been caused by a hard Brexit foisted upon Scotland against its very will.
Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Housing was mentioned 114 times in the Depopulation Action Plan. Yet Homes for Scotland were not consulted on the plan, nor were they even aware of it, despite being advisers for housing to 2040. Does the First Minister accept this failure to properly consult the sector on this plan as a huge misstep? And what action will he take to rectify this?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, we engage regularly with stakeholders. If there has been an omission, of course, I'm more than happy to look at that, and I'll ask the appropriate minister to do so. But I go back to the point I made to my response to Fergus Ewing. Housing in rural communities is absolutely essential when it comes to retaining and indeed attracting people to rural and island communities. And of course, we published our Rural and Island Housing Action Plan, published in October of last year, and it sets out a whole wide range of action that we're taking to support rural and island population. That includes, of course, continued investment in affordable housing, and of course 10% of those affordable houses being in rural and island communities, continued support to communities through our Rural and Island Housing Fund to bring forward housing where they wish to do so, up to £25 million, of course, from the affordable housing budget over the next 5 years to support housing for key workers, and a whole range of other action which I'm happy for the Housing Minister to write to Pam Goso to give her confidence that we take seriously the issue of housing in our rural and island communities.
Question number 5, Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government still has a policy of a presumption against any new oil and gas licences.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, oil and gas continues to play an important part in Scotland's energy transition. Our focus is on meeting energy security needs, reducing emissions in line with climate goals, and ensuring that just transition for workforces as North Sea oil and gas resources inevitably decline. As part of this approach, our draft energy strategy and just transition plan consulted on a presumption against licensing of new exploration of oil and gas. We've never proposed a position of no new licensing at all. So unlike the Conservatives, we're not ignoring the scale of the climate crisis that is befalling our planet. We'll work with the energy industry to accelerate that transition to net zero where we can.
Douglas Lumsden.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister makes one trip up to Aberdeen and then masquerades as the saviour of the oil and gas industry. He must think the people of the North East are buttoned up the back. He's against Cambo, he's against Rosebank, and his government still has a presumption against any new oil and gas licences. So will the First Minister tell the Chamber today why he is in favour of importing more oil and gas, stopping new investment, which, as the First Minister knows, means throwing away thousands of livelihoods on the scrap heap?
First Minister.
Of course, if Douglas Ross knew what he was talking about, he would know that the vast majority of oil that is extracted from the North Sea gets exported overseas, Presiding Officer. But what's clear to me, what's clear to the people of Scotland, what's clear to the people of the North East is that Westminster is not working for Scotland. For decades, Presiding Officer, the Conservatives have been telling the people of Scotland that Scotland's oil is running out. Now, all of a sudden, they're pretending that it's going to be lasting forever. Successive UK governments,
let's hear the First Minister,
have used the North East as a cash cow, squandering £400 billion in today's prices of oil and gas revenue. So whether it's the Conservatives or Labour, whose policies, of course, could end up throwing 100,000 workers on the scrap heap, Westminster can't be trusted with Scotland's natural resources. It's high time, Presiding Officer, high time that Scotland's energy was in Scotland's hands, so we can ensure cheaper bills, so we can ensure that we unleash the economic potential of the green revolution, and, of course, that we can help to tackle the climate crisis, Presiding Officer.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the First Minister's visit to Aberdeen this week and the engagement that he has had with the oil and gas sector. Can I ask the First Minister if that engagement with the oil and gas sector will continue, in particular regarding retaining and increasing the vital investment needed to deliver a just transition, following the deeply concerning warnings that Labour's aggressive plans for the North Sea will put 100,000 jobs at risk, which is really serious for my constituents in Aberdeen, the North East and beyond.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, many of those in the North East of Scotland will have just seen the fact that Kevin Stewart is rightly standing up for his constituents, not using Scottish Government figures, but using industry figures that say that Labour's plans could risk up to 100,000 jobs, and we'll hear Labour laughing at Kevin Stewart, laughing at the people of Aberdeen, and laughing at our oil and gas workers, who, of course, have done an incredible job for Scotland over decades and continue to do an excellent job for Scotland. Let me say this much. Let me reiterate what I've already said in previous exchanges, Presiding Officer, is this: that we support in the SNP a windfall tax. Of that there is no doubt. What we don't support is aggressive plans by Labour, not just to increase that windfall tax, but of course to raid the North East so they can pay for new nuclear power plants in England, Presiding Officer. That is unfair. That is not acceptable. So we believe in accelerating that transition to net zero. The oil and gas workers, who are incredibly skilled, who have incredible expertise, will be absolutely vital to that just transition. I can promise them, so long as the SNP is in government, we'll protect them from those damaging plans by Keir Starmer, by Labour, which would end up seeing them thrown on the scrap heap.
Question number 6, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the analysis by Citizens Advice Scotland suggesting that over 660,000 people are experiencing mental health problems due to increasing household debt.
First Minister. The Scottish Government, of course, remains deeply concerned about the impact of the cost of living crisis, especially on those who are already struggling with poor mental health and also with money worries as well. We know this is leading to far more people seeking advice and support, which is why we support free welfare debt and income maximisation advice services with funding of over £12.5 million allocated this year. Mental health remains a priority, and we have supported overall increases to mental health spend over the years. Through our 24-25 budget, the Scottish Government and NHS boards will continue to spend in excess of £1.3 billion for mental health. More widely, recognising the pressures on household budgets since 22-23, we continue to allocate around £3 billion a year to policies which tackle poverty and protect, as far as we possibly can, people during the ongoing cost of living crisis.
Paul Sweeney.
First Minister, people increasingly have nowhere to turn when their mental health deteriorates. Patients in some health boards are waiting over 1,000 days to start psychological therapy, and 1 in 4 consultant psychiatry positions are vacant. And what is his government's response to cut £30 million more from the mental health budget, despite it already being £180 million adrift from the target? First Minister, when will your government start to take the crisis in mental health seriously and reverse the proposed cut to mental health funding in the budget?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, let me just correct Paul Sweeney on some issues in relation to our funding. We have a good track record on spending on mental health. There have been, of course, that is in the face of 14 years of austerity under the SNP. Mental health spending by NHS Scotland has doubled in cash terms, from £651 million in 2006-07 to £1.3 billion in 21-22, up by almost 100%. Expenditure on CAMS rose from £88 million in 2020-2021 to £97.6 million in 21-22. Of course, we've had challenges in the budget that we have just announced, but we've ensured that we are doing what we can to invest in mental health. And what I would say to Paul Sweeney, he was right to reference the Citizens Advice Scotland report earlier. The cost of living crisis is undoubtedly a source of deep mental health anguish for too many households up and down the country. So we'll continue to invest in that. What is worrying, of course, is that Paul Sweeney's party, of course, believes in retaining, for example, the two-child limit. The person who is likely to be the next Chancellor of the UK has promised, and I quote, to be tougher than the Tories on benefits. Through our actions, we have lifted last year an estimated 90,000 children out of poverty. So the Scottish Government will invest in helping people with debt, reducing the cost of living. But how much better would it be, Presiding Officer, if we didn't have to continue to mitigate the worst excesses and harm of Westminster, but instead took all the decisions about Scotland here in Scotland?
Willie Coffey.
Thank you. Could the First Minister outline how increased funding for discretionary housing payments, for example, the impact on mental health issues in Scotland will actually help make up for the chronically insufficient UK housing benefits funding, and how we in Scotland maximise support for low-income households here in Scotland?
First Minister.
Willie Coffey makes an exceptionally important point. The damage done
by the UK Government's 3-year freeze to local housing allowance has been considerable. It's estimated, with an estimated £819 million that have been lost. This, coupled, of course, with the cruel bedroom tax policy, is undoubtedly causing great harm indeed. So while the Labour Party are failing to offer any change to these devastating policies, the Scottish Government will take action. We're investing an additional £6 million in discretionary housing payments, bringing the total to over £90 million to mitigate all of these cuts. This is helping over 90,000 low-income households pay their rent and keep their homes.
We move to constituency and general supplementaries, and I call Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the First Minister join me in offering his congratulations to my constituent, Henry Wooga? Henry escaped the Nazi Holocaust, travelling from Nuremberg to Glasgow in 1939 at the age of 15. Here he met his wife Ingrid, also a survivor as a consequence of the Kindertransport, an event celebrated in the film One Life, starring Sir Anthony Hopkins. Tomorrow, Henry turns 100 years of age. He's made a remarkable contribution to this country. I've tabled a motion supported by Paul O'Kane, and Kirsten Oswald MP is tabling a similar motion in the House of Commons. Will he join me, and I hope the Chamber, in offering him many happy returns?
First Minister.
I do. I wish Henry Wooga a very happy 100th birthday. Indeed, I've written to Henry myself personally in order to pass on my personal congratulations to him. Jackson Carlaw is right. Henry Wooga is an absolute inspiration. It was just a number of weeks ago, Jackson Carlaw and I and many members in this chamber were, of course, commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day, and we heard very powerful testimony from a number of those who were either survivors or families of survivors of Holocaust and indeed other genocides, and the work that Henry personally has done over the decades in helping to remind and to inform people of the horrors of the Holocaust, which should never ever be forgotten by any of us. It's truly an inspiration for each and every single person in this country. So I want to pass on my congratulations, the best wishes, of course, for his birthday, but I want to put on record my appreciation, the Scottish Government's appreciation, I think the whole country's appreciation for the incredible work that Henry Wooga has done, particularly in reminding us of the horrors of the Holocaust and saying that we should never ever forget them, reflect on them, and of course work together to ensure that we see peace right across the world, wherever we see violence, wherever we see discrimination, be it here at home or indeed abroad.
Jackie Bailey.
Scotland's NHS is directionless, risking patient safety and on the brink of breakdown. Not my words, Presiding Officer. That is Audit Scotland's assessment of the NHS under the SNP. In a devastating critique of the Government, it points to a health service at breaking point with extreme overcrowding and long waiting times threatening patient safety. It accuses the SNP Government of having no vision and calls for fundamental reform. The need for leadership is clear, but it is absent. Can I ask the First Minister, after 17 years of decline under the SNP, what reforms will he bring forward to save our NHS?
First Minister.
Of course we will bring forward reforms, and the Health Secretary will detail that. We'll work with staff to see what we can do, particularly in the preventative space, to see what more we can invest so individuals don't have to go particularly to secondary care and primary care, but particularly secondary care, where we know there's intense pressure on our hospital sites right up and down the country. But in 17 years, let me remind Jackie Bailey, of course, that we have record staffing in the NHS. We have record investment in the NHS. We have the best paid staff in the NHS. And of course, we are the only country in the entire UK that has not lost a single day to strike action. But I think, and I stand to be corrected, but I think today there are junior doctor strikes in Labour-run NHS Wales, Presiding Officer. So we'll continue to invest in our NHS. We'll continue to invest, most importantly, in the people who run the NHS, our nurses, our doctors, of course, all of the NHS, the Gender for Change staff, who do an incredible job, and we promise to continue to work with them for the best possible outcomes for patients across Scotland.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, this coming Saturday it will be 2 years to the day that Russia launched an unprovoked, brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. Putin's conflict still rages on. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed and maimed, with vast areas of Ukraine and many of its towns and cities devastated, with millions displaced. Scotland opened its doors and hearts to Ukrainian refugees, but the war also cost energy price rises and economic shocks. What assessment has the Scottish Government made of the impact on households affected by poverty and the cost of living crisis of the ongoing war against Ukraine? And what message of solidarity will the First Minister send to the Ukrainian people, particularly the 26,000 who now call Scotland home?
First Minister.
I'm very grateful to Kenneth Gibson for raising this remarkably important issue. I'll be joining others, I suspect, across this chamber on Saturday to commemorate that and reflect on the 2-year illegal invasion by Russia into Ukraine, of course, which we condemn in the strongest possible manner. We continue to be shocked, we continue to be appalled at the violence and the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding, continues to unfold in Ukraine, again because of Russia's illegal actions. Scotland stands by Ukraine. We stand for democracy, we stand for human rights, we stand for the rule of law at home and indeed abroad. So we offer our unqualified support for Ukrainian sovereignty, and we wish a speedy victory for Ukraine and a resolution which has to not just restore peace, but ensure Ukrainian sovereignty, democracy, independence and territorial integrity. Since the war against Ukraine began, over 26,600 people sponsored by an individual in Scotland or the Scottish Government have arrived in the UK as of the 22nd of February of this year. I'm proud of how Scotland and the people of Scotland have responded to this humanitarian crisis. I'm grateful to all of those who have opened their homes and their hearts to displaced Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. And so long as those who have fled the war and come to Scotland, for as long as they want to call Scotland their home, they will always be given the warmest welcome possible.
Russell Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The parents of Claire Ingalls have spent more than 2 years desperately trying to get answers. Ian and Fiona still don't know why her killer was in 5 separate bail orders, and they've now discovered that social workers tried to warn Claire about her violent new partner, but no one answered the door, and 72 hours later she was killed. A council review failed to answer critical questions, and I'm not putting the First Minister on the spot. This isn't about party politics, this is about violence against women. But I would urge him to please look again at Ian and Fiona's request for a thorough and independent review.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I will genuinely look at that request again and see what further we can do in terms of any further independent review into this case. I can completely understand the deep sense of grief and anger that Ian and Fiona are feeling. Russell Finlay will know, of course, that I wrote to the Lord President, the Lord Advocate, on this issue, and I passed on those responses, I think, to Russell Finlay earlier on. And, of course, many of these decisions that were taken at the time would have been for the independent judiciary to determine on. In terms of the failure, the questions and potential failures that Ian and Fiona Ingalls have articulated in relation to local authority action, I will look at what Russell Finlay has asked me to do. I will consider what furthermore we're able to do, and if there is anything further we can do in relation to an independent review, and I'll revert back to Russell Finlay directly.
And Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This week, teachers in Aberdeen told the BBC that they were scared to go to work because of rising violence in schools. A recent survey carried out by the EIS in Aberdeen found that nearly 40% of teachers had been physically assaulted by a pupil. And these statistics should shock us all, and they demand action from a government that has taken its eye off the ball and allowed this problem to grow and grow. Scottish Labour is clear that we must take a zero-tolerance approach to violence in our schools. Can I ask the First Minister exactly how much violence is he prepared to tolerate before he acts?
First Minister.
I think most people will unfortunately see that this is an issue that Michael Mara is choosing to politicise and create as a partisan issue. As always, and his suggestion somehow that having a slogan about zero tolerance will suddenly make the issue better, I'm afraid, is a complete failure of credibility on his part. What I would say is we are working with the teaching profession, because these are very serious issues that have been raised by teachers up and down the country. We take those issues extremely seriously. The Cabinet Secretary for Education has hosted a number of summits, again with educational professionals, with teachers in particular, to see what more we can do. And we've commissioned, as Michael Marrow will probably know, behaviour in Scottish schools research in order to establish the true picture, the evidential basis at a national level of teachers and support staff's experience of behaviour in publicly funded mainstream schools. Well, the results of the 2023 research highlighted that most children and young people are well behaved in class in schools. It also does tell us about that level of disruption that does exist. So it's clearly not good enough. And of course, we're working with our partners in local government to bring forward a joint national action plan to drive improvements, and I'll ensure that Michael Marrow is kept up to date.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. Point of order, Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I seek your advice under Standing Orders Chapter 9 following the publication today of the Stage 1 report of the National Care Service. The Chamber has agreed a few weeks ago that the Stage 1 debate should take place next Thursday. Members will know of my long-standing commitment to a national care service. Indeed, it is over a decade since I first proposed this, so what is currently happening troubles me immensely. I therefore seek your advice on two counts. Firstly, the conclusion of the report seems manifestly contrary to so much of the report's contents. Page after page of criticism appears to be ignored. It also appears that evidence given by the third sector and independent providers and those with lived experience is also ignored.
Let's hear the member.
The party whip has been imposed to get the bill over the line. Secondly, there is a question of the integrity of this Parliament's processes, and let me explain. Substantial changes are being made to the bill following a deal between COSLA and the Scottish Government. No evidence has been taken on this as it came too late in the process. It radically changes the governance of a national care service, and this has caused...
I would be very grateful if we could hear the member. Thank you.
This has caused...
The reason I am asking is I cannot address a comment or contribution or a point of order if I cannot hear it.
This has caused considerable disquiet in the care sector. Committee members of all political stripes have been trying to get the Scottish Government to bring forward their amendments so that they can be subject to scrutiny before Stage 2 starts. They have written to, they've spoken to the Minister, but the Government says no. One of the committee members even sought agreement to share the target operating model, which would have provided a direction of travel for the amendments. This too was refused. I am concerned that the Government does not yet have any amendments. Otherwise, why would they refuse to share them with the committee so that members can do their job and scrutinise them properly? There are unfortunate examples in this Parliament where the perception is that the committee did not do their job in scrutinising legislation. We should not let that happen again, as it is the integrity of this Parliament that is also at stake. So can you, Presiding Officer, advise if there is an opportunity for the committee to reconsider their report in light of the arguments I have made, and what would be the appropriate vehicle to achieve this? Thank you.
Thank you. It's fair to say that I didn't pick up all of the members' comments, so I will refer to them and refer back if required. But I can confirm to the member that under the rule she refers to, under 9.6.1, any member may, by motion, propose that the bill be referred back to the lead committee for a further report on general principles of the bill or on any particular part of the bill before the Parliament decides whether to agree to them. Point of order, Stephen Kerr.
Presiding Officer, I seek your guidance on the appropriate conduct of members of this Parliament and your powers to safeguard members of the public, our staff, visitors in general, to be able to enter and leave this Parliament. Because last night, members of the public seeking to enter this Parliament were obstructed and intimidated, and all of this was orchestrated and trumpeted by a member of this Parliament, a Scottish Green MSP. This is surely unacceptable conduct for a member of the Scottish Parliament to seek to prevent members of the public entering their own Parliament. So I ask for your guidance on the following. What actions will now be taken in the light of last night's events to secure safe access for the public to enter their Parliament at all times? And what action will be taken against the member who I believe has brought disrepute to the Scottish Parliament, because not only did he plan and conduct the obstruction and the demonstration, but he claimed responsibility for it. He sought to shut down this Parliament. Now, we all believe in freedom of speech and the right to protest, but the right of the people of Scotland to come safely and securely into their Parliament and leave their Parliament when they choose to do so must also be safeguarded.
Thank you. I am not aware of all the circumstances that the member, that Mr Kerr refers to, but it's absolutely clear, I'm sure to all of us, that the security of all building users and our guests is absolutely paramount. And I can confirm that I'm aware that there were extremely difficult circumstances last evening, and that all our scheduled events were able to proceed. And I'm certainly very grateful to our staff and to police colleagues who made that possible. I can assure all members that our procedures are very much kept under review and they are adjusted where that is appropriate. Point of order, Patrick Harvey.
Further to that point of order, Presiding Officer, I trust, and I hope we can all trust, that in your consideration of these issues, you will give a high priority to the absolutely essential role that the right of peaceful protest plays in our democracy and in the life of our Parliament.
I have commented on the points raised. I am absolutely sure that all members here assembled understand the importance of the right of protest, but also of the importance that we place on the rights of all building users and staff to do so securely and safely. We will now suspend this item of business before we move on to members' business, and I'll allow a moment for the gallery and the chamber to clear.
Resolution 12177 in the name of Ivan McKee on immediate ceasefire in Palestine and Israel. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members who wish to participate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I invite Ivan McKee to open the debate. Up to 7 minutes. Mr McKee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, it gives me no pleasure to open this debate. I would much rather be celebrating the creation of a Palestinian state or a state of Israel-Palestine that allows all the people between the river and the sea to live in peace, justice and equality. But tragically, that is not where we are today. The latest conflict in Israel-Palestine since October of last year has claimed more than 30,000 lives, the majority of them women and children, and the vast majority in the Gaza Strip. The conditions in Gaza, as reported by Oxfam and others, are horrendous. Disease, malnutrition, destruction of health services and living accommodation. Presiding Officer, we rightly debate in this place the health and housing challenges we face in this country. Spare a thought for the horrific conditions in Gaza at this very moment. The work of UNRWA and others in doing what they can to mitigate these conditions is increasingly difficult and never more needed, and continued funding for that work is essential. This conflict didn't start on the 7th of October. It's been ongoing for more than 75 years. This is the 15th Israeli military invasion of the Gaza Strip since 1948. The most recent in 2008 and again in 2014. The Gaza Strip has been under siege since 2007. The IDF's Dahiyya doctrine, described to us by members of Breaking the Silence, the organisation of ex IDF service members dedicated to highlighting human rights abuses is based on the principle that there will be no end to the conflict and that therefore a major strategic objective of any military operation is to deliver as much destruction to civilian infrastructure as possible so that the next inevitable clashes are delayed as long as possible. The slaughter in Gaza committed by the Netanyahu regime had now claimed as many victims as Putin's flattening of Grozny in the First Chechen War or the Assad regime's siege of Aleppo. There is no case for a delay in calling for a ceasefire. Tens of thousands have died as politicians in the West have prevaricated over semantics. Now is the time for clarity and bravery. The UK government has weight and influence in the international community. The Netanyahu regime operates as it does because it perceives a green light from the international community. Some countries have taken their responsibility seriously. I commend the government of South Africa, a country, of course, with its own experience of apartheid, in taking this case to the International Court of Justice, where an initial ruling indicates that there may be a case to answer that the actions of Israel in Gaza constitute genocide against the Palestinian people. Incitement to genocide is also a crime, and isn't it hard to find potential examples? Talk of flattening Gaza, turning it into rubble, eliminating everything, making it a place where no human can exist, creating a humanitarian crisis, removing all restrictions on the actions of soldiers, calls for collective punishment, itself a war crime, depriving civilian populations of food, water, electricity and healthcare. Not the rhetoric of some fringe figures, but worse from the leadership of the Israeli government and the IDF. Presiding Officer, it is unfortunately a tragic and recurring theme of the human condition that it is easier to be honest about events in hindsight than to recognise them for what they are as they unfold. We now recognise the events in Bosnia in the 1990s as a genocide. That was not the case, and I remember it very well, when the Major government prevaricated for years, with Douglas Hurd working to prevent defensive protective equipment being delivered to the defenders of Sarajevo. The massacre in Srebrenica brought about the downfall of the Dutch government, but not until some years later. And the actions of the government of France, the ex-colonial power, is in at best acquiescence and possibly complicity in the now recognised genocide in Rwanda. I raise these examples, Presiding Officer, because they provide a lesson to those who play politics with the slaughter in Gaza, who delay and prevaricate and triangulate, waiting for others to make the first move to give them political cover. The Augustinian approach to ending atrocities. Please, Lord, stop this slaughter, but just not yet. And let us not forget what is happening in the West Bank, which I visited in 2018. Land theft continues. Palestinian rights continue to be eroded. Death of Palestinian civilians have soared to more than 300 in this period. The reality, of course, is that there can be no military or security solution to the problems of the region. After nearly 5 months of bombardment of Gaza, the fighting continues. The tunnels are still there. The IDF continues to take casualties. Hamas continues to function. The hostages still haven't, for the most part, been found or freed. Indeed, the IDF has perhaps managed to shoot more hostages than it has liberated. Voices in Israel recognise this. We all want to see the release of hostages. The quickest way to do that is through an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. Indeed, the only significant release of hostages came about through the brief ceasefire in November of last year. Those negotiations must also lead to the recognition of a Palestinian state, something I believe is now the position of the UK Labour Party. If Keir Starmer is the next Prime Minister, I hope to see this promise delivered without delay and not abandoned, as has been the case for other commitments. I know there are many good colleagues in the Labour Party who will work to make that a reality. This motion also recognises the many Israeli and Jewish voices who condemn the actions of the Netanyahu regime, recognising that not only makes the lives of Palestinians hell, but also prolongs the conflict and makes Israelis less safe too. Breaking the silence and B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organisation, and many others. I have attended and spoken at rallies calling for a ceasefire and been heartened and encouraged by the number of Jewish voices present and speaking at those events. I leave the last words to Jewish voices of the past that resonate today. The leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Marek Edelman. To be a Jew always means being with the oppressed and never the oppressor. And Dutch Holocaust survivor, Hayo Meyer, talking about the situation in Palestine, never again for anyone. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr McKee. I am aware of the very many members who wish to participate in this debate. I am therefore minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. I invite Mr McKee to move such a motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. The question is that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. We are nevertheless under extreme time pressure. Afternoon business is due to start at 2 o'clock. Staff will need to come in to prepare the chamber. So I propose to conclude the debate at 10 to 2 at the latest. I intend to also make sure that all members who wish to speak have a chance to participate, but they will have to stick to their time, and members towards the end of the debate may even have to truncate their remarks further. On that note, I call first Jackson Carlaw to be followed by Neil Bibby. Up to 4 minutes. Mr. Carlaw.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I note the opportunity afforded by Ivan McKee with his motion today for the Chamber to have a further discussion on this really troubling and horrendous international situation. First of all, can I, as I've done before, pay tribute to the many interfaith organisations here in Scotland who are working really round the clock every day to do all they can to maintain cohesive relations here in Scotland, and with some real track record of success. And we owe them a huge debt of gratitude in ensuring that a very tense international situation does not dissolve into a very serious situation in our own country here in Scotland. This is a short debate, and therefore there are two areas that I'd like to address in my contribution. Obviously, the events since the 7th of October have unfolded as badly, or even more badly than any of us could have anticipated or predicted at the time of our last discussion. I have to say that irrespective of the speeches we make here today or the calls for action from anywhere, it doesn't seem to me that we are anywhere near a resolution or even a mitigation of what is a desperately difficult position currently in the region. And the consequences of that, I think, were very clearly and fairly laid out by Ivan McKee. At the heart of this is the call for a ceasefire. This shouldn't be a competition between parties for who's got the boldest ceasefire. This is a question of the principle of a ceasefire. And people, I think, are troubled at why I and some others are reluctant to join in that call for an immediate ceasefire. And it's not really one of principle. It's one when I look at the terms associated with the calls for ceasefire that I see from the letter that Ian Murray sent to Stephen Flynn, or from the resolution even of the Labour Party at the House of Commons yesterday, a great deal of which I could agree with. But contained in these calls for a ceasefire is a recognition that there has to be a ceasefire on all sides, meaning rockets in and out of Gaza have to stop. It's a recognition that the hostages have to be released, 134 of whom still remain unaccounted for, including Kerr Bibas, who is 1 year old, Ariel Bibas, who's 4 years old, and Adam Berger, who's 19 years old, of whom nothing has subsequently been heard. And it does, I think, implicitly in the rhetoric of all, mean that at some point there has to be a way forward in Gaza that does not leave the Hamas regime in place dictating the future, because they have made clear that they will not respect a ceasefire and they will immediately resume at the earliest opportunity their attacks on Israel. We cannot have a ceasefire where Israel ceases and Hamas fires. It has to be a ceasefire that we can believe will happen. And in those circumstances, if the hostages are released, if Hamas is no longer able to influence the outcome of events, and if there is a mutual ending to the attacks from both countries, I can then support a ceasefire, and I hope out of that we can see a much more likely and secure future for the region. Meanwhile, aid now can come into the country unrestricted. There are some 13,000 trucks that have entered over 3 crossing points. There are currently, at the moment, 450 aid trucks in Gaza, with aid that cannot be distributed. And I recognise that there is a genuine fear on the part of those who would distribute that aid that they can do so safely. So I can certainly support the idea that there should be a pause in hostilities in order for that aid to be as widely distributed as is possible. Nor do I think, as I've said before, that I support every action of the Israeli government. And I resent and reject the suggestion that I do. People ask me, why do you bother with any of this? Well, I stand here in a parliament with Muslim MSPs, with Sikh MSPs, with Hindu MSPs, with Protestant MSPs, with Catholic MSPs, but no Jew. never a Jew. And as the representative of 50% of Scotland's Jewish community, I, as my immediate predecessor Ken McIntosh did, believe I have a responsibility to articulate arguments on their behalf. But that is not the same thing as endorsing all the actions of the Israeli government.
Thank
it is
you,
important
Mr. Carlo.
we work
going
together
to
secure a future.
I'm going to call Neil Bibby to be followed by John Mason. Up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Ivan McKee for bringing forward this debate. The situation in Gaza is tragic and it is heartbreaking, and I know there are strongly held views across the chamber on this, an issue we all care about. So many innocent lives have been taken or destroyed. Countless children have died and continue to die each and every day. There are many families here in Scotland with relatives in Gaza and in Israel who have been impacted by this horror. These are the victims of this tragedy, and we owe it to all of them to do everything we possibly can to end this terror. Presiding Officer, I welcome that the House of Commons has joined this Parliament in voting to call for an immediate stop to the fighting and a sustainable ceasefire. This follows the leaders of our allies, Australia, Canada and New Zealand, in calling for an end to the hostilities in order for hostages to be released. I'm going to focus my remarks on what needs to happen to help people on the ground now, because a cessation of the violence is the only thing that will help right now. We need an end to the fighting and an end to rocket fire coming in and out of Gaza. This is needed in order to allow hostages to be safely exchanged whilst they're still alive, and for food, medicine and other aid supplies to safely get to those who need it. We also need to say with one voice to Israel that, like any other state, it has the right to defend itself, not least from indiscriminate terrorist attack, but every state has the responsibility to exercise restraint and proportion in its response. There are very legitimate questions to be asked about Israel's actions. The International Court of Justice is the proper place for them to be adjudicated on. We respect their jurisdiction, and so too should Israel. We should also say with one voice that an assault on Rafah, where 1.5 million people are crammed together in unimaginable conditions with nowhere they can go, would be unconscionable and would have disastrous consequences. Approximately 75% of Gaza's population are displaced, most of them in Rafah. 17,000 children are estimated to be separated from their families. We need de-escalation, not any further escalation. The 7th of October 2023 saw the largest loss of Jewish life in any single day since the Holocaust inflicted by Hamas. And since, as Ivan McKee has said, almost 30,000 Palestinians, the majority of them women and children, have been confirmed killed. Presiding Officer, this has of course been an ongoing situation for decades. From the ashes of this tragedy must become a renewed emphasis on a two-state solution, which is a position that all parties here share. A safe and secure Israel, with the horrors inflicted by Hamas, a brutal and anti-Semitic terrorist organisation, on October 7th can never happen again. And a viable Palestinian state alongside, with safe borders and ultimately recognition for that Palestinian state. A state, as an Asawa recently put it, which is not in the gift of any neighbour, but is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. In the face of the horrors of recent months, it is easy to sink into despair and hopelessness, but we must not. That will not help the innocent victims. That will not stop the deaths, the terror and the violence. The two-state solution is still worth hoping for and still worth fighting for. We need to see every avenue of engagement with Israel and the international community to achieve that outcome and defend that outcome. World leaders must redouble their efforts to forge a path to a sustainable and lasting peace, so that future generations of innocent men, women and children are not consigned to the horrors and violence we have seen in recent months. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Bibby. I now call John Mason to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much, and I thank Ivan McKee for bringing this debate today. The situation we see in Israel and Gaza is incredibly sad. It is also very long-running, certainly since well before 1948, when you could say that the present problem started. Clearly, anti-Semitism is not the same as valid criticism of Israel, but neither are the two completely distinct and unconnected. Most of the Jews I know in Scotland, and in England as well, have family and friends in Israel. It is the only Jewish state in the world, and according to the Bible is the land which God gave his chosen people. Now, having said that, it does not mean that we cannot criticise the Jews or Israel. God himself is hugely critical of his people in much of the Scriptures, not least when he punished them by exiling them to Babylon and elsewhere. So it is not anti-Semitic for some to say that the present Israeli offensive has been over the top and has possibly crossed the line from defence to revenge. At the same time, we need to be balanced in our approach. For example, to say that we must not sell arms to Israel, but that it is okay to sell arms to Saudi Arabia or others with a much worse human rights record is somewhat inconsistent. It's very difficult to ascertain what all the facts are around what has been happening in Gaza. The number of deaths is one issue. Of the Palestinians killed, I gather that Hamas claims that 6,000 have been military, whereas Israel claims 12,000 were Hamas fighters. All such figures are very difficult to verify when both sides have a fairly unclear line between who is military and who is civilian. It does seem that the number of civilian deaths in Gaza has been greater because Hamas deliberately built tunnels for military purposes underneath hospitals and residential areas. And on that point, where did all the resources come from for these tunnels? Perhaps the situation for ordinary people in Gaza would be better today if more resources had gone into civilian infrastructure rather than being diverted for military purposes. And I do think the United Nations, and particularly the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, have some responsibility in this regard. Going forward, I think we need a more neutral agency than UNRWA, helping the people of Gaza to rebuild. So looking ahead, where are we going? In the short term, we want the fighting to cease, and that has to be linked to release of the hostages, or sadly perhaps their bodies, and both sides need to agree to ceasing fire. But longer term, we need serious peace talks and negotiations. That requires all sides to recognise the other's right to exist, and we should remember that it is Iran and Hamas who openly declare that they want Israel wiped off the face of the map. I do partly blame the international community for not pushing harder for peace talks over the years. Both Israel and Palestine are relatively small entities in world terms. Much larger players like the United States, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Iran have a key part to play in this too. They can put pressure on the respective sides to get to the table and negotiate. There should be no preconditions on borders or anything else. Only an acceptance of the other side's right to exist should be required. But having said that the bigger countries have a part to play, we should remember the example of Norway, who hosted peace talks in the early 1990s. I have to say that I would like to see both the United Kingdom and Scotland playing that kind of role as peacemakers. That means not cheering on either side, but building relationships with both sides and hopefully being trusted by both sides. To finish on a more personal note, I was in London just after New Year and attended a Jewish synagogue one Friday evening. There were only about 15 to 20 people there, but they had to have 3 security guards on duty. What happens in Israel and Gaza does affect us here too, so let us all commit to being as even-handed as we can be and to seek to be peacemakers as much as we can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. And I call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Up to 4 minutes, Ms McNeill.
Thanks to Ivan McKee for bringing this important debate and so timely. And apologies to the presiding officer and the chamber. I set a meeting last November that I unavoidably have to chair. I can't stay right to the very end. I think those who know me know that if it was not for that, I would be here to the end. So I do apologise sincerely. As we all speak today, Israel launches more airstrikes in Rafah. So sadly, there will be even more deaths than the 30,000 civilians so far, but up to 100,000 injured. 10,000 children with no functioning hospitals and no services to protect them. No emergency services to rescue people from under the rubble. Gazans go to sleep at night knowing that their relatives are buried under the rubble and may still be alive. 1.7 million people displaced more than once, and some of them were already refugees from 1948 and 1967, but now many have been displaced 5, 6, 7 times. It is the speed of the bombs, the unprecedented scale of the military operation, the indiscriminate nature of the bombs that strike Gazans, including white phosphorus. It's like nothing we have witnessed in any recent modern war. Those who have followed the horrible and horrific examples of what has happened in Gaza couldn't have failed to notice the story reported by the Palestinian Red Crescent Society of Hind, a young girl who died alone But while she tried to call emergency services, her last hours in the car, where she was surrounded by the dead bodies of her relatives, reports of a tank coming towards her, and a few days later we found out that she was dead. But the strategy laid bare because the Israeli hostages, who must be released and must be protected, are not even a priority for Netanyahu, and that's clear by the statements he has made. And also members of his government have also said there is no such thing as an innocent Palestinian, and other more extreme than that have said that when they clear Gaza, then they want to see more settlements and the Palestinians removed. It's about time we stood up and said that the dehumanisation of the Palestinian population, the denial of their rights and their existence, is not tolerable. They can't even leave Gaza. Most of members who have participated in this debate before know that they've been under blockade for 17 years. Well, really, the world has a lot to answer for, actually. I don't really have time, unfortunately. Unless I'm allowed time, but I can't see it. No, sorry, Paul. Dr Gillian Harris, who, like many brave doctors have served in Gaza, recently report they do expect to see young men in the emergency services, but what they're seeing is children. And that's because over 50% of the population in Gaza are under the age of 18. But whilst this happens, there is still more violence in the West Bank. You won't see so much of it because you're watching what's happening in Gaza. The violence is quite horrific. Settlers who are Israeli illegal people in the occupied territories are stealing Palestinian homes, but they're also being protected by the Israeli army to do so. I believe that Palestine is the moral question of our time, and not just to stand up for a ceasefire now. Because as Ivan Key said in his opening speech, 75 years since the Palestinians were promised a state of their own, 56 years of illegal occupation. Over 100 countries recognise Palestine now.
You do need to conclude.
It's not out of step. Where you stand on this question matters. The hopes and dreams of Israelis and Palestinians depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Ross Greer. Up to 4 minutes, Mr McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to thank Ivan McKee for bringing this debate to the Chamber. I think it's fair to say that Ivan has always been a champion of this issue, prior as well to the current crisis that is unfolding. On the 21st of November last year, I stood in this chamber and fully condemned the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel and the following collective punishment of the Palestinian people by Israel. And I also repeat that all hostages must be released. I stand by these comments and fully condemn violence in all its forms. Pardon me. But what has happened since we last debated this issue in here should shock and shame us all. Over 30,000 in Palestine dead, 12,300 plus children, 8,400 plus women. That's children, women and innocent civilians. That's not Hamas terrorists. Hospitals and schools have been hit hard, and we've all seen the scenes on the TV. Absolutely shocking. What could possibly be the justification for the continuation of this slaughter? Some suggest that while Hamas still exists, this is justified. I am fully of the opinion that it is not. These are innocent people, and many, as we've said, are children. So let me be clear to those people who believe this. It is and cannot be a justification. And as we've heard from Ivan McKee and others, Jewish voices are increasing in the condemnation of these actions by Israel. I'm pleased also that Ivan McKee's motion mentions the ruling by the International Court of Justice, and I hope that all governments of the world acknowledge this. And the scenes in Rafah, as Pauline McNeill mentioned, are heartbreaking, as many people have fled to this area and are now facing the threat of continuing attacks there. It's actually just unthinkable what the people of Palestine and Gaza must be feeling. So ceasefire now is the only option. Why do some politicians, as we noticed in Westminster yesterday, still reluctant not to call for a ceasefire? We don't need to worry about other actors to call for the end of slaughter of innocent civilians. As a friend said to me recently, and I quote, "If this was literally anywhere else in the world, it would not be tolerated." he's right. Because there's plenty of examples of that. Ukraine, for example, what we have done is right, and we should be very proud of our stance in Ukraine and the Ukrainians that now call Scotland their home, including many in Coatbridge. I'm personally very proud of that. And of course there are other examples too of the UK and Scotland taking an international stance on war. But it seems to me that the children and people of Gaza are second-class citizens to this UK government and other governments of the world. What do we tell our kids about what we've done at this point in history? Pauline McNeill said it much better. This is a pivotal moment, but an issue of all our generation. It's absolutely shocking, and our kids, our young people and everybody else are watching the scenes unfold on the TV. What are we doing? What are politicians doing? There must be a ceasefire now. Fighting must end on all sides. A two-state solution and the recognition of the State of Palestine must be found. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I now call Ross Greer to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Greer.
Thank you, President Officer. And like colleagues, I want to thank Ivan McKee for having brought this debate and to thank CoCab Stewart for the work that she did on this before her appointment as a Minister. And I want to start by congratulating those who peacefully protested outside this building last night, those who took direct action to try and obstruct the arrival of Israel's arms dealers to this nation's parliament, whilst the nation of Israel, whilst the military forces armed by those companies conducts a campaign of genocide in Gaza. The real shame at this building last night was that an event, a wine reception for arms dealers, went ahead during a genocide. And is there any doubt now that this is a genocide? More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, including at least 12,500 children. And we know that number is an undercount because we know the reality is the vast majority of those reported as missing are dead under the rubble. That's why they're unaccounted for. I want to read for a moment from an article in the Los Angeles Times by Irfan Galeria, who's an American surgeon who spent time in Gaza in recent weeks. He said, "I stopped keeping track of how many new orphans I had operated on. After surgery, they would be filed somewhere in the hospital. I'm unsure of who will take care of them or how they will survive. On one occasion, a handful of children, all about ages 5 to 8, were carried to the emergency room by their parents. All had single sniper shots to the head. These families were returning to their homes in Han Yunis, about 2.5 miles away from the hospital, after Israeli tanks had withdrawn. But the snipers apparently stayed behind. None of these children survived." Presiding Officer, the Hamas attack on the 7th of October was horrific. It was evil, it was unjustifiable. But members will remember that a lot of attention was paid not to the very real stories of horror that day, but in the days after, a lot of attention was paid to a false story of 40 babies being murdered in one kibbutz. And I have to note, so many of the same news organisations who reported that story are silent about the actual massacre, the verified massacre of children taking place in Gaza, the deliberate slaughter and execution of toddlers, of babies, even when it is recorded on video. Children are having their limbs amputated. Women are giving birth by C-section without anaesthetic because Israel is blocking medical supplies from getting in. Gazans are being collectively punished, and that is a war crime. We all know that is a war crime. And the shameful events at Westminster last night put this whole country to shame because one party refused to acknowledge that the use of the word collective punishment was appropriate. Attempts to bully and threaten the Speaker of the House of Commons to derail a ceasefire debate put the UK to shame. But while that farce was taking place, Israel was still bombing Rafah, a refugee camp of 1.5 million innocent people. And the question was asked, why does the UK's position matter? Why do debates like in the Commons last night or here today matter? Well, it matters because the UK arms Israel. The UK gives political support to Israel. The UK blocks Israel being held to account at the United Nations. No one looks back at the international campaign against apartheid in South Africa and claims that it was of no consequence. And nobody will look back at the international campaign of solidarity with the people of Palestine and say the same thing. And we can make a direct impact here in Scotland. Rather than invite arms dealers in for wine receptions, we should divest all public funds, including our pension funds, from them. We should ban every company complicit in the occupation from receiving a public grant or a contract. The First Minister agreed to that in principle in December. We need to see progress on that. Presiding Officer, we need to see an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We need the release of all hostages, Israeli and Palestinian hostages, including the children held in Israel's jails. We need Israel to withdraw to its 1967 borders, end the siege of Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank. That is what we need for a lasting peace.
Thank you. I now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Marie McNair. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Since this member business motion was tabled, the situation in Gaza has worsened significantly. The daily death rate in Gaza is higher than any other major 21st century conflict. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, including more than 12,300 children, and 69,000 have been injured since the 7th October 2023. Neither of these numbers include the thousands still missing under the rubble and collapsed buildings. The Israeli Air Forces have reported that it has struck 30,000 of what it has identified as Hamas targets in Gaza since its offensive began. These strikes have also completely destroyed 70,000 housing units and damaged 290,000 more. 392 education facilities, 11 bakeries, 123 ambulances, 3 churches and 184 mosques have been reported to have been completely or partially destroyed. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs have reported that not a single hospital in the Gaza Strip is fully functioning. As a result of this lack of functioning healthcare, there are over 200,000 cases of acute respiratory infections and over 500,000 cases of communicable diseases recorded. There is now a seriously insufficient supply of food, proper sanitation and clean water. Just last month, the IPC warned the serious food security concerns. 2.2 million people are now at the imminent risk of famine, with 378,000 of them designated Phase 5, demonstrating extreme lack of food, starvation and exertion of coping capabilities. Israel, of course, has a right to protect its citizens, but it also has responsibility to abide by the international law and to minimize civilian casualties. The situation in Gaza has now gone far beyond a justifiable response following the 7th October attacks. Collective punishment of any civilian is never the answer. Israel's war cabinet have now warned that the remaining hostages are not released by the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan. It will burden its offensive in southern Gaza and push into the city of Rafah. The Rafah crossing is Egypt's remains one of the only possible routes out of Gaza. Rafah is currently home to over 1 million of Gaza civilians who have been displaced and have fled there to seek shelter. If this ground invasion takes place, the death toll could be unimaginable. If this ground invasion takes place, the death toll could be unimaginable. An immediate and lasting ceasefire is now imperative. This means diplomatic mediation to ensure lasting agreement and permanent two-state solution, an end to rocket fire both in and out of Gaza, immediate humanitarian aid into Gaza, and the immediate release of all hostages. The fighting must stop now before we are looking at the complete inhibition of Gaza and its civilian. Ceasefire now. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Marie McNair to be followed by Richard Leonard. Up to 4 minutes, Ms McNair.
Presiding Officer, we need an immediate ceasefire and an end to the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. We, as a forward-thinking and compassionate nation, cannot stand by while an obvious genocide happens. The killing of innocent civilians and the brutal slaughter of children must end. The civilian death toll, which stands at around 30,000 people in Gaza, over 1,000 people in Israel and more than 300 in the West Bank, is rising daily. The only way to end the suffering is an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages and those detained without charge. The relentless suffering faced by the people of Gaza has been weighing on the hearts and minds of so many across the country. Andrew Gilmore, the UN Assistant Secretary-General for Human Rights from 2016 to 2019, said just 2 days ago, Israel's onslaught against Gaza is probably the highest kill rate of any military killing anywhere since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. I have joined thousands on the streets to protest and call for an immediate ceasefire and an end to collective punishment and an end to illegal occupation. I'm glad to see that since this, and with the pressure from the SNP, the New Labour Party has backed calls for a ceasefire, at least of a sort. External pressure does more for Labour at the moment than enshrined in internal principles. The Tories and the Labour Party made a devastating mistake opposing a ceasefire in November. Lives have been lost and the death toll has since risen enormously. And their failure to back this earlier will be remembered in the history books with their name on it. New Labour's position yesterday in Westminster was appalling. The New Labour cabal came together to deny a motion that called for an immediate ceasefire and the end to the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Newsnight's journalist Nicholas Watt said the Commons Speaker was left in no doubt that New Labour would bring him down after the general election unless he allowed a New Labour weak amendment on Gaza. And obviously the New Labour Junior Deputy Speaker, Rosie Winterton, was then deployed to defend the indefensible. Like most Labour stitch-ups, it ended in a disaster and humiliation, but it's still cheered on by some lapsed Corbynistas in this Parliament who want to be chummed with the arms industry that provides weapons to Israel. Most of us here have never experienced anything close to the level of horror in Gaza. So what has really stuck with me were the comments from Dr Salem Gady. Dr Gady grew up in Gaza and has family there, and now works as a consultant paediatrician in Inverness. When he was discussing his family, he said, "The stories of immense suffering, I hear from them every day. Every part of their life turns into an astonishing amount of suffering. There is nothing in their life that you could consider a life, actually. Water is contaminated and they eat one meal a day. The number of children killed is around 12 to 14,000. Do you know how many children there are in Inverness? 14,000. Imagine we, the Scottish people, wake up one day and all the children in Inverness have been killed. This is what happened to the children in Gaza. Stop, enough is enough. Stop this genocide, please." These comments are terrifying. This perpetual cycle of violence has been ongoing for far too long. We either call for the killing to end or sit by and let the death toll escalate. History will judge us all in this, and we need an immediate ceasefire and an end to the collective punishment.
Thank you. I now call Richard Leonard to be followed by Bill Kidd. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank Ivan McKee for leading this debate? And may I say to Marie McNair that we are here with power borrowed from the people. We are here with a chance to make a difference, to do the right thing by humanity. Because what we are debating today is a profoundly moral question. It's not an electoral calculation, it's a profoundly moral question. Which is also why I say to the government, you cannot vote in favour of a ceasefire and condemn collective punishment and continue to fund those firms in Scotland which are arming the Israeli government. International law must apply to all. Supplying arms to a country in breach of international law is itself a breach of international law. And why is it so easy to supply a state with weapons, but so difficult to supply starving children with food and injured people with medicines? It is my deepest conviction that all that the people of Israel and Palestine want is the chance to live in peace. And in the horror of this war, all that the people of Gaza want is to live. They want their children to live, and they want to live free. We condemn the action of Hamas on the 7th of October. I don't support Hamas. I want peace. I want the return of all hostages. And when we call for a ceasefire, we are calling for a ceasefire on both sides. But history did not start on the 7th of October. The story of the Palestinian people is a story of injustice, of forced dispossession, of forced displacement, of forced dispersal, of forced disinheritance. And today, once again, innocent people, including thousands upon thousands of children, are being punished for a crime that they did not commit. So there is a deep revulsion against what is happening, the terror of what is happening, the criminality of what is happening, the morality of the slaughter of innocents, including children, which is why it would be a betrayal to remain silent, which is why the calls we have heard since October for pauses or de-escalation are tantamount to indecision at best, to compliance with a reign of violence that has so far killed 30,000 people, 40% of them children at worst. As the Palestinian people are once again being told to flee their homes, we should heed the words of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who wrote, "Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky?" To speak out as a member of this Parliament is not an act of protest, but the exercise of power. It is to show political and moral leadership. It is to stand up for hope in place of fear. It is to be realistic, because it is to be realistic to want to change from this existing reality to a new one. That is why many of us are here. That is what I am here to support. Justice for humanity, an end to the illegal occupation, freedom for Palestine, the triumph of peace over war. Ceasefire now.
Thank you. I now call Bill Kidd to be followed by Carol Mochan. Up to 3 minutes. Mr Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Last November I put on record my condemnation of the horrific, inhumane terrorist attack on Israelis carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October. Today, Presiding Officer, I reiterate this condemnation, and I add to this my condemnation of the horrific, inhumane actions we have since witnessed unfold on the innocent civilian population of Gaza. As I said in November, humanity defines human beings collectively. Therefore, collective punishment is an act of inhumanity. We do not get to pick and choose which acts are humane or inhumane. If we wish to condemn one act of inhumanity, we must condemn all acts of inhumanity. To do otherwise is simply to debase ourselves as human beings. Since then, the situation has only worsened and the suffering has only intensified. Over 29,000 Palestinians dead and over 66,000 injured. Figures that may seem clinical to some, but I urge us to look beyond mere figures. Over two-thirds of those killed are women and children, over 200 a day, families torn apart. And of those injured, there are children traumatised for life, limbs amputated without pain relief, to be left screaming in the darkness for hours without end. We must condemn this too. We must speak as one when it comes to ending this inhumanity. Yesterday, we witnessed the House of Commons descend into chaos when debating the issue. Today, please, let's speak with one voice, a voice that echoes and amplifies the overwhelming view of the international community, of the world. That voice says enough is enough. The time is for a comprehensive ceasefire and credible peace process is now. Let us speak with one voice for those suffering, but let's not forget we are a voice for our constituents too, and it saddens me to listen to young people who are affected by what they hear and see happening in Gaza, but feel powerless and inexpert and unable to speak out on the mental distress this causes them. In this respect, education as to the history and to the seeds of today's conflicts are invaluable. In reading over the material for this debate prepared by Spice, who I thank, I was heartened to see an overview of the history of this land front and centre. It gives us context, it gives us knowledge, it gives us understanding. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, today, as new reports show that around 90% of Gaza's children under 2 are malnourished or worse, and starvation looms for many more, and the relentless bombing continues day and night, and the spectre of a ground invasion of Rafah with over 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering in fear for their lives, there seems like little hope. However, let us speak as one and offer hope for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. And I call Carol Mochan, the final speaker in the open debate, up to 3 minutes. Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And might I thank Ivan McKee for bringing this vital debate to the Chamber, his work in this area and his comments, kind comments on the work that we have done across the benches together. When all around us is war and the lust for war, it is important to be clear that we in this Parliament stand for peace. I do not need to reiterate the sheer number of needless deaths in this conflict or the plight of people taken hostage or tortured. In my contribution, I would like to, as I have done before, raise a terrifying reality that is often left unmentioned by the media: the disgraceful number of women who have lost children they are carrying or shortly after birth, and in many cases simply prevented from having access to the necessities of childbirth, that is, pregnant women. There are about 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, and 40% of those pregnancies have been classed as high risk. 180 women still give birth daily. Can you imagine? Despite this, they must carry a child exposed to constant bombing and try to give it adequate nutrition in a country that has been starved to death. Can any of us even begin to imagine what this is like? To not have clean water to hydrate yourself or to clean and wash your newborn baby. I note, as was noted by the International Court of Justice in the recent order, that under international law this is illegal and Israel must stop doing so. Yet since that ruling in January, reports of exactly the same actions have come forward, and I cannot adequately explain how I feel about this. How must the families feel? They must be absolutely terrified. To carry a child can be a worrisome experience at the best of times, but in a war zone, and to realise that no one is coming to help you, it is utterly unimaginable. As a citizen of one of the most powerful countries in the world, I feel desperately ashamed that weapons funded from the UK and no doubt manufactured in Scotland have been used to perpetuate this. There is no amount of GDP that is worth being involved in this. As I close, I want to be clear, the time for peace came long ago. This has gone well past the point of self-defence, and the leadership, both Hamas and Israel, are engaged in a fatal battle to the death that will spill further across the region, which is, of course, a worry. Presiding Officer, the violence must stop. We must not remain silent. We must have an immediate ceasefire. Can I thank the Chamber for the opportunity to speak and raise these voices and say that I am glad that on the whole we have had a constructive tone in the Chamber today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. I now invite CoCab Stewart to respond to the debate. Minister, up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to thank Ivan McKee for securing this debate. The conflict in Gaza is a human tragedy, and it is important that this Parliament's voice is heard. The Scottish Government has been consistent in condemning the abhorrent terrorist actions of Hamas, whose vile and merciless attacks on the 7th of October represented the single worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and in calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire by all sides in Israel and Gaza. A ceasefire is the only way that we can halt the catastrophic human suffering in Gaza for hostages to be released. I repeat the Scottish Government's demands for Hamas to release immediately and unconditionally all hostages and to cease all missile attacks against Israel. Hamas can have no future in Gaza. But the cycle of violence must end. The bombs and rockets must stop. Humanitarian and medical facilities must be protected, and civilians must be given unrestricted access to the basic necessities of life wherever they are. Presiding Officer, Israel, like any other country, has the right to protect itself and its citizens from terror. In exercising its right to defend itself, however, Israel must abide by international humanitarian law. The First Minister has urged the UK Government that the time has come to speak out forcefully and make it clear that Israel's military action has gone way beyond a legitimate response to the appalling attacks of the 7th of October. The Scottish Government respects international norms and the rule of law. It is therefore correct that any potential breach of international law, including the crime of genocide, should be investigated by the appropriate authorities and international bodies. The interim ruling of the International Court of Justice on the 26th of July was clear. The killing and destruction in Gaza must stop. Urgent humanitarian assistance must be provided to prevent more suffering, and hostages must be released immediately. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's position is consistent with the vast majority of the international community. The United Nations General Assembly voted in late October for a resolution that demanded an immediate, durable, sustained humanitarian truce, leading to a cessation of hostilities. In December, a much larger majority of the General Assembly voted for another resolution that demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access. And just last week, the Prime Minister of our Commonwealth partners, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, issued a rare joint statement calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and for hostages to be released. That statement was inspired by increasing indications that Israel is planning a full-scale assault against Rafah, which until the last few weeks has been a relatively safe place for displaced Gazans as this brutal conflict has progressed. The President of the United States himself has reportedly urged Prime Minister Netanyahu not to launch a military operation in Rafah without a credible and executable plan to protect civilians. Since then, we have heard the chilling warning from Israeli ministers that such an offensive will take place before Ramadan unless hostages are released without any mention of how civilians, most of whom have lost their homes, are to be protected. I would like to take a moment to pay tribute to the contributions, and I would like to say that this has been a respectful and serious debate that has taken part this afternoon. I would like to thank Ian McKee, Pauline McNeill, Richard Leonard, who outlined very effectively the historical context within which this conflict lies and the emotional and heartfelt contributions that they have made. I would also like to say to Jackson Carlaw that I would like to reassure him that, in my opinion, it is a political intervention that will bring this to an end and not a military intervention. Neil Bibby spoke of de-escalation, which I think is essential and I have called for myself. And John Mason was quite correct to point out the international community for not trying harder for peace talks over the years. I would also like to pay tribute to Faisal Chowdhury, Pauline McNeill, Carol Mochan, amongst others in this chamber, who have mentioned the devastating impact on human life and birth and death, as well as the infrastructure that is being devastated across the region. Can I thank Ross Greer for highlighting my own previous work on this and his commitment and the historical context with which he pointed out as well. Several members across the chamber were quite right to highlight that collective punishment is unacceptable of innocent civilians. I would also like to acknowledge Marie McNair, who mentioned marching alongside thousands of people, as have many colleagues in this chamber. The people are on the streets, presiding officer. We need to make sure that we are on the right side of history and reflecting for them. And in fact, members here have said that we are speaking for our constituents. And Bill Kidd, who said quite rightly that we should be in this place, be speaking with one voice as we are going towards the future that has hope. Presiding officer, we must recognise the deep trauma suffered by the Israeli people as a result of the 7th of October attacks. And we must also acknowledge that this trauma is felt by the Jewish communities globally, including the Jewish communities here in Scotland. The conflict in the Middle East does not justify racial or religious hatred of any kind, and in recent weeks we have seen a shocking global increase of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I want to emphasise that there is no place in Scotland for this behaviour, and that the Scottish Government is committed to building supportive and safe communities where divisive narratives will not resonate. We'll continue to engage closely with our communities across Scotland to provide vital reassurance and ensure that nobody feels marginalised. I thank you for your patience. In conclusion, presiding officer, I'm pleased that the House of Commons has finally agreed to call for an immediate ceasefire, which the Scottish Government has consistently done for months. Presiding officer, enough is enough.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate, and I suspend very briefly this meeting of Parliament until 2 p.m.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.